activities. So today we are going to have three lectures here, and the first one is Professor Walter. I'll say some few words about him. Waltinho, yeah, exactly. So, so, uh, okay. No, it's funny because it's something. Waltinho is something that I wrote here to say now. Yeah, hope you like it. Okay, so I wrote something just to don't make a mess. But one of the things that I love most about academic life is research collaborations, and and what is even more fantastic is when you discover that an academic you admire, such as Walter, is not only a top-notch scholar but also a wonderful person. Uh, yeah, and I consider myself fortunate to have encountered a few individuals in my career who have had such an intellectual and personal impact of me. And Professor Walter, affectionately known as Waltinho in my lab, uh, is one of these individuals. I'm really enjoying a lot the time you are here. It's great. We exchanged many emails during the last years, working in projects and in some papers. Yesterday, the paper on refugee that we started discussing, mostly, I think it's approved, yeah, our paper. Yeah, I think it's approved, and we need to celebrate that. So thank you for coming, Walter. So Walter Waltinho is Chauncey Stillman Professor of Practical Ethics in the Department of Philosophy and the Cannon Institute for Ethics at Duke University. He's core faculty in the Duke Center for Cognitive Neuroscience and has a secondary appointment in it's much better, in the Duke Law School. He serves as research faculty in the philosophy department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, partner investigator at the Oxford Center for Neuroethics and Research Science with the Mind Research Network in New Mexico. He has received fellowships from the Harvard Program in Ethics and Professions, the Princeton Center for Human Values, the Oxford Center for Practical Ethics, the Australian National University, and the Sage Center for the Study of the Mind at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He has served as vice chair of the board of officers of the American Philosophical Association and co-director of the MacArthur Law and Neuroscience Project. He earned his bachelor from Amherst College and his PhD from Yale University. He has published widely on ethics, theoretical and applied as well as meta-ethics, empirical moral psychology and neuroscience, philosophy of law, epistemology, philosophy of religion, and informal logic. He has many books, and Morality Without God, Moral is I don't know how to speak this. Is skepticism. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, okay. And is editor of a beautiful series called Moral Psychology, volume 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 books. And so he's working, I think, now on a book on freedom, responsibility. I think I found something at the internet. I don't know if I'm right. So here's Professor Walter. It's a great pleasure to receive you, Walter. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Oh, I should. Can you hear me now? Is this working? What do I do? Now it's working. Okay. Thank you so much for having me, Paolo, and the entire lab. This has been absolutely magnificent. All that stuff's in the past. I'm going to tell you today about the future because that's the theme of this, which is to say we're going to talk about some brand new work that's not out yet. Really, it's Paul and Majulika's study. So you thought I brought Paul just because he's fun, but actually I brought Paul so if there are any hard questions, Paul is going to answer them for you. Okay. So I thought it would be a good topic to do here because it really is about the future. I think in the past, moral psychology has studied a number of different things. They studied moral judgments about, which acts are right or wrong, which people are good or bad, who's morally responsible or blameworthy, and so on. Those are the judgments that we think about, what we think of the actions that either we do or other people do. Uh, People have studied moral emotions, including anger, disgust, moral outrage on the internet and other places, empathy as a source for more positive moral actions. People have studied the actions themselves. It's really hard to get the IRB to approve an experiment where people do actual immoral actions. But my favorite 3 studies that do so are one by Jorge Mal from Brazil, who did a charity experiment way back in 2007, a beautiful experiment. Molly Crockett has gotten people to shock people and lie to people for money. And Ming Xu is not known very well, but he was great. He got a grant from the U.S. government to send meals to starving orphans in Africa. And people just had to decide which orphans got them. And so it was a study in distributive justice where it actually was sending meals to needy people. So a lot of that work has been done. But what we want to suggest is that the future lies in studying moral motivation. Not the future. Part of the future lies in studying moral motivation, because you need to understand moral motivation in order to understand the relationship between judgment and action. You judge that an action is wrong. Well, most people, that will motivate them to not do it. But some people will go, yeah, man, I'm going to do it. It's wrong. I want to do something wrong. I feel like rebelling. And so you actually need to know their motivation, or you can't link the judgments people have studied to the actions people have studied. We want to design interventions to make people behave more morally, to do less of the outrageous things that people often do. But you can't design those interventions or manipulate their motivation unless you understand what's really going on in their motivation. So I hope that in the future, moral psychology will focus more on motivation. So how are we going to start studying it? Well, I'm a philosopher, right? I'm not a psychologist. What am I telling you about moral motivation for? Well, philosophers have talked about moral motivation for many years. Way back in ancient Greece, Socrates said that everybody is motivated to seek the good. That is, if you judge it to be good, you'll be motivated to do it. If you judge it to be bad, you'll be motivated not to do it. And he argued for that view back in the Meno. Some recent philosophers like Alan Gaworth have developed this into an entire theory, and they're interesting and worth looking at, but very few people believe that anymore. Hobbes and Hume said, well, here, motivation. You're motivated to satisfy your strongest desire. So they're putting it all in terms of desires. Then you get Kant, who says, no. You don't want your moral actions to be motivated by desires. You want them, in order to have the goodwill, which is the only thing that's valuable without qualification, in order to have the goodwill, you have to do your duty for its own sake, and you use your reason to figure that out. So then Bentham comes along and he says, well, it's not desire, it's not duty, it's you seek pleasure, you avoid pain. So you can see these philosophers have had assumptions about motivation throughout the ages. It's not a terribly new topic. Economists more recently, and many philosophers have followed them, have used the notion of preference. You always do what you prefer to do, so we just got to get your preferences straight. Sometimes called utility, sometimes separated from utility, but it doesn't matter. The point is they've each got their words. So we've got judgments, we've got desires, we've got duty, pleasure, pain, preferences, and what we're going to argue is that they're all wrong, because motivation comes in many different kinds. It's more complex than any of these traditional theories really understand. It's more varied than these traditional theories understand. That goes for psychological theories as well, and we'll come back to some psychological theories of motivation. But first, I want to give you an example just to show you why we think motivation is more complex and varied, okay? This is meant to be a realistic example. It is fictional. I really wish I could find a video of somebody doing this, but maybe we will. We'll see. But I hope it's realistic at least. So what we're imagining is that Frankie's elderly mother is, not in good shape, and some recent family news, you can imagine whatever you want. One of the grandchildren is gay, and that would upset her, whatever the news would be. And Frankie's father asked Frankie not to, don't tell your mother. That's just going to upset her. It's not going to do any good. Just don't tell her, okay? So now what are Frankie's motivations as he thinks through what he should do, as he deliberates before he reaches a verdict? Frankie has some harm-based motivation to avoid what's bad. Assuming that it's bad, that upsetting his mother is bad, he thinks it's bad. And so he has some motivation based on harm to avoid doing that, okay? But at the same time, he has some honesty-based motivation to approach what's good, because he thinks it would be good, it's good for people to know the truth. Knowledge is a good thing. Truth is a good thing. It'd be good for her to have that truth. And he has some attraction or motivation to approach that good thing. So he's got motivation to avoid the bad and to approach the good, okay? Also has some authority base. You notice harm, honesty, authority. I'm referring to moral foundations, which are very common in moral psychology today. He has some authority-based moral motivation to avoid what's good. Namely, to avoid telling their mother the truth. Why? Because his father told him not to, right? And the father is seen, and Frankie sees the father as an authority, and so he has some motivation to avoid what is good. And let's just assume that Frankie also has some moral motivation to approach what's bad. He wants to upset his mother as revenge for this slight that she did to him. He knows he's not justified, right? What she did to him is not, enough to warrant or justify him making her upset in this way, but he still wants to. How many of you have ever felt that way? No, you don't have to admit. You don't have to admit. But I think many people have. And so now notice what we've got here is 4 different motivations. We've got a motivation to avoid what's bad, to approach what's good, to avoid what's good, and to approach what's bad. I wish I could get rid of this somehow, but I don't know how. And so we're going to work with those 4, as you'll see, for quite a while, and this is meant to illustrate them. I've got to say a word about what's good and bad mean here. First of all, it's subjective. What we mean, what the agent sees as good and bad, because we're interested in what motivates them. So us coming from the outside and saying, well, other people think it's good, or it really is good, it's not going to be helpful in understanding their motivation, okay? So we're meaning subjectively good or bad for the agent, okay? We also want to include both intrinsic goods, which are things that are good or bad in themselves, and also instrumental goods, where the only thing that makes it good or bad is that it's a means to a certain end, or that it's going to have a certain bad effect, not in itself, but in relation to something else. Both of those are included when we're talking about what's good or bad. And we're talking about it being good or bad somewhat, okay? So you go, well, learning the truth is good. But that doesn't mean it's like overall the most important thing and nothing could override it. That just means it's got some value, some positive value to it. Other things might have more value. You have to weigh them against each other. But it's the kind of thing that gets weighed when you're trying to weigh good things and bad things against each other. Philosophers call that pro tanto, good. Okay. So I take it that's a fairly common kind of problem that Frankie has. It's not something extremely unusual. And so prior theories should be able to handle cases like that. So let's look at prior theories. Well, some prior theories of moral motivation, like Hoffman and Blasi, I think that's how you pronounce it. Is that how you pronounce it? Is it Blasi? Okay. They point to one single element. They say, well, it's emotion that provides moral motivation. You go, okay, that's not terribly helpful, because which emotion are we talking about? And is it always emotion, or is it sometimes just thinking, like Kant said it was just judgment, and reason? And so it's not going to be comprehensive, and it's not going to be terribly informative. Moral identity, again, a single element. Part of the problem there is, does Frankie really have that? Does Frankie have strong or weak moral identity? Well, he's got conflicting moral considerations. So it's not a matter of whether he has strong moral identity or weak moral identity, right? That's not going to help you locate where he is in terms of moral motivation, because he has moral identity is pulling in both directions at the same time. Okay? It's also not enough to cite one dimension. What people do is they say, oh, I've got more than one element. I've got two. And then they put them on opposite ends of the spectrum. So you got to be on one end or on the other end, and then we're going to understand your moral motivation. John F. Bowman did this. But then you go, okay, so where is Frankie? If the dimension is avoiding bad versus pursuing good, well, wait a second. Approaching good, the truth, he's going to be over here, but he also wants to avoid the bad, and he also wants to approach the bad, and he also wants to avoid the good. Where do you put him on this single dimension? And it's not going to help if you just say, good motivations and bad motivations, because again, he's got a mix of these different things, so you can't locate him. You don't know what to do with Frankie in a case like that, okay? So what we suggest is that moral psychologists who want to understand motivation need to turn instead to circumplex models. Now, these types of models have been around for quite a while. Probably the best known one is arousal and valence for affect, and that's the one we're listing here. So affect can go in valence from unpleasant to pleasant, and in arousal from activation to deactivation. And you can distinguish different ones here. You can't read these, so I'll have to read them for you. But let's just say something that's very pleasant and also very arousing, you're excited. Something that's very unpleasant and very arousing, you're nervous or stressed or whatever, right? And so you can distinguish the different emotions by where they are, not on a single dimension, but in this in these four quadrants. Okay, now that's emotion. It's not motivation, but in some circumplex models, like Atkinson, much earlier, you actually get motivation to approach or avoid, as we were mentioning before. What he was interested in is a motivation to succeed as a student. And some students have high approach, they have a strong motivation to approach success and a low motivation to avoid success. Well, then they're going to be success-oriented. But some people, they combine a high approach for success with a high motivation to avoid success. They're kind of scared of being too successful. They don't want to succeed. And then they overstrive and end up undermining themselves. And he wants to understand those kinds of students. And he uses this type of model to understand the motivation in those types of complex and conflicted cases. What we want to do is extend this type of model to moral motivation. Because success in class is not a moral situation. And so we want to do it for moral things. So unlike the prior models, our MoMA model is going to include moral motivations. All I mean by that is motivation to do something that is viewed as morally right or wrong on the basis of features that people view it as making it right or wrong. I'm not committing myself to it really being right or wrong or anything like that. Remember, we're talking subjectively here, okay? And we're also going to include two. So you remember here, let's go back. Whoops. There was just one cross here. We're actually, again, in our model, include two crosses because we think we need approach and avoid for the good and approach and avoid for the bad. So there are actually going to end up being 4 dimensions in the model that we're going to argue for. And just to make sure that we understand the model, I'm going to go through 4 really simple cases to help you understand how the model works. Okay? Avery. Okay? Avery has a motivation to help a stranger in need. We're going to call that an altruistic motivation because it's aimed at the other person and to give positive benefits to the other person. Avery thinks that's good, so that's a motivation to approach a good thing, helping the other person. Okay? And motivations can vary in intensity. We're just going to use 0 to 10. We could have said 0 to 100. You can have real numbers if you want instead of whole numbers. But you need something to represent the intensity. You could even just have ordinal rankings. You don't need cardinal numbers, but I would have to, it's very complicated to explain how you would do without cardinal numbers at all. So let's just assume that in this case, Avery's altruistic motivation has strength 7. And let's also assume that Avery has no other motivation, because you don't have to, like Frankie, have all 4. So this is a pretty simple case. Approaching the good 7, approach bad 0, avoid good, avoid bad 0, just 7, okay? Now Beck, a little more complicated, has the same altruistic motivation as Avery, but also has a motivation to see the needy person suffer. Not to cause them to suffer, just wants to sit there and watch them suffer, right? And so why would they do that? They think this person is an enemy or a rival, or for whatever reason, they want to see this person suffer. And so it's kind of a sadistic motivation. What they want to do is avoid helping the person, because helping the person would be reducing their suffering, and they want to avoid that. So they actually have a motivation to avoid the good. Not necessarily to cause the harm, but to avoid the harm being reduced. Okay? And let's just, again, assign an arbitrary number. This number will, of course, change from person to person. But for Beck, let's say it has motivation 3 and no other motivation. So now you get, is there any way to get rid of this? I don't know. I don't know how to do that. It's not on my screen. It's only on the other screen. So maybe if we switch screens. I don't know how to get rid of it. That's okay. I'll just tell you what's on the bottom line of the slide. Okay, that's good, yeah. Is that good? Is that big enough for everybody to read? Okay, good. So you can see now, so Beck has motivation to approach good 7, avoid good 3, okay? And now Camden, same 2 as Beck, you know, similar in those respects, but adds one more. Camden's boss is watching, and Camden has a motivation to deceive their boss by pretending to help the needy without really helping. Now, this could be an instrumental goal, like they want to get a raise from their boss or praise from their boss. They want something out of it. But it could just be they're like a pathological liar. They like to deceive people. I study psychopaths in prisons, and it's amazing. They'll just lie for fun because they like to deceive people. It's a way of getting power over other people. And so let's suppose Camden's like that. And that's a motivation to approach bad, assuming deception is bad, and that Camden thinks it's bad. It's a motivation to approach bad, whether it's instrumental or intrinsic, either way. And it's assuming that's strength 2, no other motivation like before. Then we have motivation to approach good. You can see, you just add the 2 up there. And then Dylan has the same 3 as Camden. Motivation not to lie or deceive. They were, you know, they read a lot of Kant, or they were brought up thinking that it's wrong to lie or to deceive. So this motivation is to avoid something that's bad, the very deception that they also have a different motivation to approach because they have conflicting motivations. Let's assume that this one has strength 6, and then you get a complete table with all 4, right? So it's like the Frankie example in the beginning. There's motivation to approach and avoid both good and bad. And you've got all 4 dimensions there. We'll add more dimensions later, but 4 is enough for now. So how are we going to represent this pictorially? Because some people, I must say, we have this disagreement among the authors. I like this, right? This like makes sense to me. This like, be still my heart. You know, a table with the numbers in the boxes, I can comprehend. But there's this pressure among my co-authors to add some kind of pictorial representation here. So I suggested this one, that what you do is you simply have the x-axis is motivation to approach, 0 to 10. The y-axis is motivation to avoid, 0 to 10. Then you put the B where the motivation regarding the bad thing lies, and the G where the motivation regarding the good thing lies. And so if you have motivation to approach good 7, then you got to go out 7, but avoid it. Now you got to go up on the y-axis 3, and the G goes there. And you can represent the bad same way. Motivation to approach is 2, and to avoid you go up 6, and there you go for B. And so I think this is this is one way to represent the information. Both ways work pictorially. How do you use this information? Well, got to draw your diagonal, right? And then what you get is that in the area below the diagonal, to the lower right, the motivation to approach is greater than the motivation to avoid. And in the area above the diagonal, to the upper left, the motivation to avoid is greater than the motivation to approach because the diagonal is where they're the same, right? And G is below and B is above, which means that the motivation to approach the good is greater than the motivation to avoid the good, and the motivation to avoid the bad is greater than the motivation to approach. So you put it all together, and that's going to predict that Dylan is going to do the good thing. And we help the person in need in this case. And avoid the bad thing. Avoid deceiving. Like really help and not just deceive the boss into helping. Now, of course, the whole point of this is there can be other cases where there are conflicting motivations. So what if both B and G were below the diagonal? Then what would the model predict? The model would predict that Dylan's kind of unstable. Sometimes he helps the needy and sometimes he doesn't help the needy. And when he does help the needy, he actually feels kind of regret because he also wanted to deceive his boss and he didn't get a chance to do that because if he deceived him, he wouldn't have helped the needy. And so you can now explain why, if they're both down here, you're going to get instability, an unsecure prediction. Maybe you predict that it'll help the needy, but you only predict with probability 0.6 or 7 instead of 0.9, right? And what if they're both above? Well, if they're both above, you get the same kind of instability and you predict with low probability. But in that case, he wants to avoid them both. So now if he helps the needy, he feels like, darn, I didn't get to avoid the thing that I wanted to avoid, and that's remorse, not regret. These are technical words. I can explain remorse versus regret to you, but at least in the philosophical literature on emotions since John Rawls, they've been distinguished in that way, or something like that way, okay? So you can notice that you're not just trying to understand what Dylan will do and why Dylan does it, but also what's the aftermath? What's the residue? How are they going to feel after they did it? How is that going to affect their future actions as well? For that, you need the complex of all four motivations, not just everything on one dimension. Okay. Now, this is Paul's way of doing it. And you guys can vote about which one you like best. But this is the way Paul does it, okay? The approach good motivation here is 7. So it goes up 7, and it's on the axis here, okay? The avoid good is 3, so it goes down 3 because its motivation to avoid is down there. So you basically got 0 to 10 on each of these 4 axes. And then for avoiding bad, you had 6, so you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then what do you do to get the overall? The overall motivation is then you take the highest of approach the good and avoid the good and subtract the lower one. And you take the highest of approach the bad and avoid the bad, and you take the, and then you subtract the lower one, okay? So the highest of approach good is 7, subtract 3, you get 4. The highest of avoid bad is 1, 2, 3, right, is 6, subtract 2, and you get 4, right? So you locate it that way, okay? And then the prediction is based on which of the quadrants the overall motivation falls under. So if the overall is in the upper left, then approaching the good is greater than avoiding the good, and approaching the bad is less than avoiding the good, bad. So Dylan's going to do the good. Same prediction as the other way to portray it. If it's in the lower right, then approaching the good is less than avoiding the good, and approaching the bad is greater than avoiding the bad. So the agent will do the bad thing and not the good thing, right? So they'll deceive and not help in the Dylan case. So you get the same kind of predictions with a different way of depicting the information. And the upper right, it's going to be, they're going to waver, the prediction is going to be uncertain. That's going to explain why they feel remorse or regret, and the same if it's in the lower left. Okay. How many people prefer Paul's way of doing it? How many people prefer my way of doing it? Yeah. No. No, I think, what we're going to say in the paper is, you can do it either way. It's just different ways of depicting the data. You pick which one works for you. Okay. So the real question is not how do we depict it, but why do we have to be so complex? Why do we need all 4 of these things? Couldn't we just simply, well, you average the motivations to approach the good and avoid the bad, and then you average the motivations to approach the bad and avoid the good, and then you subtract the second from the first, and that gives you the overall motivation to do good. And if it's positive, they'll do it. If it's negative, they won't do it. And try to put it on one dimension like that. And the answer is, the reason you can't do that is you have to distinguish Dylan from other cases. I mean, take Emerson. If you did the averages of approaching the good and avoiding the bad, 4 and 9 is 13. Well, wait, so 7 and 6. So you're going to get the same average. And 5 and 0, 3 and 2, you're going to get the same average. So if you average them all, what you lose is the strength of the individual one. So you're not going to be able to understand why, if Emerson ends up doing it, why do they feel so bad? They shouldn't feel any, they've got the same motivation. You're going to lose all of that extra information you get from keeping the 4 numbers separate and looking at it as an array of numbers rather than a single sum or average. The same thing's going to happen with different examples. If you add up and down the columns or subtract or whatever you want, you can always come up with another person with what seems to be a very different motivational profile, but the same sums or the same average or the same difference. And so we say you need to keep them all separate. Okay. Not only do you need to keep them all separate, but these things can change over time. So you could say, well, here's, it's not Dylan or Emerson anymore. Maybe it's back to Frankie. We got to have F. So time 1, you get this array. Time 2, time 3. So you can see that the approach good motivation is going down over time, but the avoid motivation, good motivation, is going up over time. And what does that tell you? How does adding Tom help? Well, you want to explain not just whether Dylan's going to help, or Emerson's going to help, or whoever is going to help. You want to know when they're going to do it. And so if you can track it over time and see when it goes from positive to negative, you're going to be able to predict and explain why they did it at that moment instead of before or after. So adding the time gives you extra explanatory power. Okay? Then you can also look at the different areas of morality, different moral foundations, if you will. You could have care and harm. Well, an individual's motivation with regard to care might be this profile, whereas with regard to fairness, it's a very different profile. They might care a lot about one but not the other, and you're going to lose that information, that difference between different individuals, if you just add them up or multiply them or subtract or divide or average or whatever you want to do, right? So there might be some value in adding this. Notice it's an empirical question, how much value it adds, right? And so there's a lot of work to be done, and I came to Brazil so you guys would do that work for me. But the theory, at least, as a, the theory is that you need to keep them separate in at least some cases in order to understand the differences among people and what's going on in particular cases. But wait, you got time, you've got moral foundations. What if you want to put them together? Whoa. So now what you can do is you can just, see, I do love tables. And so in the table, what you do is you just have an ordered set of the numbers indicating the first member of the ordered set is the first time, the second is the second time, and so on. And you can extend the ordered set as long as you want, and then have the strengths of the motivation to approach good, where the good is about care and harm. At time 1 is 5. The motivation to approach good for care and harm at time 2 has intensity 4, and it's going down. So these are the same numbers as in the previous one. It's going down. And you can do ordered sets of moral foundations as well. So you have time 1, time 2, time 3, approach good, approach bad. How many musicians are there? Good. So now, see, this is like a clef. So now you're going through the piece of music, right? And you have different lines on the clef for the different ones, and then you either have a quarter note or a half note to represent, right? And it can be a chord if you have an ordered pair, And so now you can actually just kind of use standard musical notation to understand moral motivation. I thought that was cool. I don't know. Anyway, so how much time do I have left? I haven't. 5 minutes? 10 minutes. I should keep talking for 10 minutes or 10 minutes including discussion? Okay. I want discussion, though. I'll go quickly through this, and then you can ask questions about it. Distinctive features. Directionality. We're distinguishing approach from avoid, like the Atkinson circumplex model and like a lot of other models in other areas of non-moral motivation. Multi-dimensions. Good versus bad. And I think that's a big one here because previous people overlook the distinction between these two and end up putting it on a single dimension for that reason. The intensity. We can know not just the absolute strength, but the relative strength of the different motivations by indicating it in numbers. Variability, change over time, and situation, because why does it change over time? Well, the situation changed, and that changed your feelings and your motivations, okay? The content with moral foundations. So those are features that I think many of them are lacking from previous models of moral motivation that MAMA is supposed to add. What does that get you, all that extra complexity? Well, you're allowed to compare, it enables you to compare individuals, right? Avery, Beck, Cameron, Dylan. You can explain exactly what the differences are among the different individuals in their motivational profiles. It enables you to predict actions and emotions from patterns rather than simply averages or totals. And we think that might lead to greater precision in the predictions that we're able to do. It enables you to measure the effects of, say, internal character traits. You know, I'm low on glucose, or I'm tired, or, you know, I just got a paycheck and I'm happy. How does that, you know, affect the various kinds of motivations for internal? But external situation, it could be, you know, is this beggar, you know, how does this beggar smell? Or, you know, is my boss watching? Or those types of external situations. And you can actually measure the effects, and they might affect some of the motivations, but not others. So again, we get much more precise. We can relate studies and theories because, you know, this theory of motivation found this, and this theory found that. Well, often they're not talking about the same thing, but we can specify what they're talking about, okay? We can look for neural substrates, because who ever thought there was a center in the brain for motivation, right? As a whole, you've got to have to subdivide and see which areas are related to which particular ones, and mental illnesses. So we're going to be able to say that, you know, what does depression actually reduce your motivation to do? Maybe some things and not other things. What does psychopathy reduce your motivation to do? Maybe some things and not other things. I can tell you stories. They do all kinds of things. And prescriptive theories. When should your motivation affect how much we blame you for what you did, or how much we hold you responsible for what you did? Again, that might depend on the array of motivations and not just on, did you want to do the good thing? Something crude like that. So you can make those theories much more precise. Of course, there are limitations. How to assign numbers. I mean, you've got lots of equipment in your lab. We could figure this out with, like, we could do a subjective self-report, you know, like online, but what we really want to do is, let's do, you know, actually Paul will tell you about the approach avoidance tasks later. We want to do galvanic skin response. We want to do EEG and fMRI. We want to do eye tracker. We want to do FNIRS. You've got all the equipment. Help us out. And our hope is that it'll confirm the evidence. But remember, this is about rethinking the future. We don't know whether it's going to work, but we hope it will. Okay. So future directions include doing those different types of measures. Uh-oh. Something just went. Anyway. Well, you can imagine the future directions. The future direction says, we got to define the terms, like what exactly do we mean by good and bad and situation, and I haven't done any of that stuff yet, and that's going to require a lot of philosophy help. And then we want to have the actual, you know, tests of when it works and when it doesn't, see what it predicts, which parts of the whole theory are necessary to make the predictions precise, and which parts are just kind of wasted. They're not really doing any work. But all that would be interesting stuff that you here in Brazil are going to do for us, and we're very grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Walter. So now we are open for questions. So who would like to start? No question? Okay, Fernanda? Anna? Sorry? I'm muted. Ah.
So, is this working? Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for your speech. It was wonderful. We learned a lot. I was wondering, actually, how do you experimentally tested the approach and avoidance task? I know you and Paul told me a little bit about it yesterday, but I was wondering, how could we understand people's motivations to approach good and avoid bad and stuff in, like, daily life, or more real experiments, you know, like closer to daily life?
So I'm loud enough to go here, right? You hear? Oh. Okay. So that's a very good question, and Paul's going to tell you more about it on Friday afternoon, but not everybody's going to be there, so I'll steal a little bit of his thunder. The technique which has worked in other contexts is to take a completely neutral frame, which is sometimes either a horizontal box or a vertical box, but it can also be a color. So those of you familiar with the Stroop test, it might be easier to do it in terms of color. You put, for somebody like Dylan, you say, help the needy, and it's in either yellow font or blue font. And the instructions are, ignore the word. If it's yellow, move a joystick towards you. If it's blue, move a joystick away from you. And of course, you counterbalance that in other parts of the experiment. And you don't have to use a joystick. You can use buttons on the keyboard. But you time them. And the prediction is that the more they are motivated to help the needy, the bigger the difference between moving it towards them and moving it away from them. So sometimes you get help the needy in blue, sometimes you get it in yellow, and it's the difference in the timing indicates the strength of the aversion to helping the needy versus the desire to help the needy. And then you have to do it again with deceive your boss. And if somebody goes, yeah, then you know they're motivated to deceive their boss. And you haven't even told them why. But you can do it separately for get a promotion. And then you can see like how the motivation, the instrumental motivation to get a promotion relates to the kind of intrinsic motivation to deceive their boss just because they like to deceive people in power and stick their thumb out at authority. We learn a lot about that from Paul, and because he loves to stick his thumb out at authority, don't you? Never mind. So the idea is you can measure the separate motivations using this approach avoidance technique. You can do it for good things and for bad things, and then separate them out. Now, none of that's neuroscience, right? So it'd be nice if we had EEG, FNIRS, eye tracker. There can be other techniques to confirm that method, but that's the approach avoidance method.
Yeah. So, Fernanda, we have something similar to this. We have program at the biopack room to collect the skin conductance and heart rate frequency. We have an approach and avoided task with the joystick that you used it in Will's project. Instead of morality, it was beauty, but it's easy to adapt. It's already programmed. We just need to have this. So instead of approach or avoid the beauty or the ugly, it's just morality. But we have program using electrophysiology. So I think we can quite fast put this in the lab running. Yeah. That's why you are here. Yeah. So yeah, we can after show you these things at the lab. Yeah. We can put it together. People there.
Hello, I love circumplex models. And we run approach avoidance task with a conflict model. I don't know if this is the case of so in the conflict, it's like you can simulate perhaps a moral conflict when you have to approach something that is not good and avoid something. So I think it's a critical measure. Also, we did so because in a task where we had food and rotten food as stimuli. So we were interested on personality and in biological models of personality that are very much related to that. So like approach and avoid the good and the bad, let's say. And in the conflict situation, we would see let's say, a pattern of anxiety where you have a doubt, when you have uncertainty. So in the uncertainty, we expect to detect a difference on the decision to approach or avoid this kind of food. We didn't find much, to be honest. But I think there is another aspect that perhaps we missed, and this is maybe a good input in the addictions theory. Not very recent, but let's say a decade ago or a bit more, we split the wanting from the liking in motivation. And I think it did a lot of good for the research, meaning that sometimes we do, let's transfer that for the moral motivations. Sometimes we do things that are not according to our values or according to our decisions, but we just do it. Let's say drinking and driving, just a small. But then, so it's more due to the wanting than the approval or the liking of our actions. So perhaps this could help on studying the motivation for moral issues too.
So I couldn't agree more. My only, I totally think we should focus on conflicts. We've got to distinguish liking versus wanting. I love all of that work. And I guess my main response is, please send me your papers so we can cite them and read them and so on. The one thing I wanted to ask about that I'm not sure about is anxiety, because that's a good point. If you coalesce them all into a single number, you can't predict anxiety. But if you keep the numbers separate, you can determine a conflict. So if both B and G are in the lower right, you get a conflict. Upper left, you get a conflict, and you predict anxiety. But you said you don't get much. And my prediction, I don't know whether you really did actual actions, but I bet the anxiety happens when you really have to do it. So let's do an approach getting money and avoiding causing harm to other people, and then give them Molly Crockett's task of, well, we'll give you $10 if you shock this person 3 times. Now they're in a conflict, and you should be able to, with skin conductance or something, determine their levels of anxiety while they're making that decision. We actually did that for hypocrisy. Hongbo Yu at Santa Barbara has a wonderful test for feeling guilt that you can see with a, you can tell whether the person's feeling guilt from a brain scan. And so you can predict, like, how much guilt are they feeling. Anxiety is different from guilt, but you could try to use similar techniques for anxiety. So you're absolutely right. That's a future direction that I think would be very promising. How do you predict when people feel anxiety, even though they know they're doing the right thing, right? And so that could be very helpful, I think, to a lot of people, including people with mental illnesses and lots of people.
If anyone discover how to cope with anxiety doing the good thing, please let me know.
Everybody would love to. Thank you, Walter. I will approach the one question I can approach, because the other one is make me avoid it. It's about the Joshua Green whole theory about deontology and utilitarianism, but going straight through to an experimental paradigm for studying moral decisions. We have been using moral dilemmas for some 8 years by now, and you mentioned something about the probability of consequences, I guess. Do you have any hints on how can we tackle that point? Because for 8 years we haven't been able to. Your actions are going to end up in these or those consequences, but every time we debrief one of our subjects, they say, well, I don't know if the person I'm going to push from the boat is actually going to be wholly eaten by the shark. And maybe they're just going to lose one arm. Maybe they can swim very, very well. So this is some at least a bit to do also with the anxiety issue, I guess, that Lizzie was bringing up. Anxiety is possibly interacting with the avoidance of uncertainty, with the intolerance of uncertainty of those people. So this is actually to put in the air the probability aspect of consequences of actions, whether they are moral or not, social actions, and if you have any hints or any words of wisdom about that.
I mean, well, again, I think I mainly completely agree. I think probability is overlooked by many people, and they just assume, well, these subjects in my experiments do what I tell them, and I tell them to imagine this. And no, they actually don't always do that. And so you need to put probability into the mix. I don't know any great way of determining their assessment of a probability of an event other than just asking them, how likely do you think it is in some crude way? You can in some cases you can say, well, how much do you bet, that this will happen? But you can't do that very often in moral dilemmas. The IRB won't approve it. But we've done it before, and it's made a big difference. I'll just give you one more example to support your point. John Haidt had this famous case of Mark and Julie, who were brother and sister, and they went off on a weekend and had incest together. But nothing happened. They were closer because of it, and she didn't get pregnant, and nobody ever found out. But people still think it's wrong. So what we did is we said, well, how much of a risk do you think they were taking? And that explained almost all of the effect of why they thought it was wrong. That they thought, like, oh my God, how awkward would Thanksgiving dinner be, in front of your parents? And so it's like drunk driving, like you said. It's like drunk driving. You're taking a risk for not an adequate reason, and that can do it wrong. You'll miss all of that if you don't ask them, how likely do you think it is? How realistic is the scenario? And fine-tune your scenarios very carefully to avoid that kind of confound. So I agree. The people online need to hear.
So I would like to ask, how can we verify, how can we be sure that the results that you get from the motivation strength could be generalized to other contexts? So I think the question really is, how can we be sure that motivation is what is determining the responses?
So, we need another microphone. I can just use that one.
I don't know if just one is.
And the answer is, you can't be sure. Life is not like that. And it's not my fault. Nothing in your life will you ever be sure of. But seriously, how do you reduce the uncertainty? More experiments with slightly different ones. So you're right. We test causing pain with electric shocks versus getting money for yourself, right? Then we change it. You're not causing pain with electric shocks. You're hitting them with a hard object, and you get a food certificate, not money. And then you change it, and you change the benefits and the burdens, and you have to test how far it generalizes. You should not assume it's going to generalize. I think psychologists, look, philosophers do it too, but psychologists generalize way too quickly. They get one result on one kind of moral judgment, and they go, see, morality is like this. And it's like, no, morality is not like that. The kinds of scenarios that you used are like that. So the generalization problem is big. Now, why do they do that? Because it helps them get grants. It helps them, get audiences at their talks. If you make a really minor claim, you're not going to have the same kind of uptake. So I understand the motivation, but we still need to stop it. Stop overgeneralizing for the very reason you were saying.
So actually, I was wondering if, you said, you told us that you haven't tried that these are not neurological measures yet, but have you started considering trying or maybe doing like an fMRI study? Because I was thinking that if you did that, it would be very easy to do a collaboration and do an FNIR study or an EEG study if we knew what areas we're looking for different kinds of motivation.
So yeah, that's one of the future directions on the slide you didn't see. But yes, absolutely, that would be the way to do it. Now the problem with fMRI is going to be the temporal resolution, right? You don't know whether you're getting their actual reaction at the time or their reaction to their reaction, which occurs just 100 milliseconds later, say, because they might feel, oh my God, I can't believe I actually wanted to deceive my boss, and now you react against it and start feeling guilt. And fMRI, it's really hard to deconvolve all that. But with EEG, you could do better, but then you don't have the spatial resolution, so you don't have regions of interest that you can build into your hypotheses. FNIRS has got its limitations too. It's all superficial, in the sense of close to the surface, although very deep in other ways. And so the idea would be we need to use a variety of techniques and see where they converge. You can always hope.
And I think then it could be, I don't know, the last question, just to keep the program.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. We'll be glad to do the work with you, of course, not by ourselves. We need you. I was wondering about emotion circumplex. I'm more familiar with it. So in this valence and arousal circumplex, we can use that to characterize features of stimuli, right? So we can take that and see how words are represented in it, or images in the IAPS, things like that. You think we could do that with this model too? And what would be the stimuli itself? What would we be characterizing? Because I was thinking here, and maybe actions, but that depends, right? So the same action in your examples could be approachable or avoidable. So, or maybe we could use that to try to characterize existing stimuli, like existing scales, or come up with scales. What are you guys thinking in that regard?
Great question. Thank you, by the way, for citing Janet Scheichborg yesterday. I took a picture, and I'm going to send it to her, because she thinks people don't cite that paper enough. But for your question, I don't have any data yet, and so what should we use it for? We should use it for whatever it's useful for, and we got to find out what it's useful for, and then we decide what to use it for. But in terms of speculation, I would say that when we get to our model, that, like here, you have different states that are either pleasant or activated and so on. I would say what belongs there in the moral circumplex model is character traits. It's a different character trait for somebody who's strongly motivated to approach the good, but also strongly motivated to approach the bad, than somebody who's strongly motivated to approach the good, but, weakly motivated to avoid the bad. They actually kind of like it a little bit. And so you're going to get different character traits associated with different combinations of emotions, maybe varying with situation, so you'd have to have a distribution across situations, But I would say what belongs in those points along the outer edges are character traits rather than point emotions at a particular time. I mean, point motivations at a particular time. Yeah.
That's awesome. So let's have I think a break. There is some coffee and juices and water, and so I think like 15 minutes, I think is enough, and then we come back to the other two talks. It will be Professor Elisa over there, and Professor John Naslek from using the Zoom link. Okay, so 50 minutes. So now it's 10:15, 10:30. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Walter. It was beautiful. Thank you very much. Oh, man. Thank you. Deny. Ô, Ana, aí depois que eu apresentar, eu vou pôr a dela, aí é só por share, né? Tá. Ok, guys. Ainda não. O meu? Ah, mas eu ponho só o dela depois, não é só a imagem. Okay, let's move to our second speaker. So, we're now moving from morality to the music. So, yeah, that's beautiful. So, I would say some words about Elisa, but let's show something about Elisa. Yeah. This is her group called Samba Samba Laranja, the Orange group from Syracuse, Orange guys there, yeah. So it's beautiful. You can go to the internet and you are going to find many beautiful videos. They playing Brazilian songs, maracatu. You play mawaka songs as well. Many beautiful stuff you can find at the internet. Also at the how would say, like Apple Music, just kind of Spotify. You can find the CD. It's beautiful music made by Elisa and her husband, another musician. And with your students at the university, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful stuff. So you need to. I just put some few seconds here. I should put the whole video. Yeah. Okay. so the idea here, you're going to see we have Elisa today from the music, and also on Friday we're going to have Sabrina from the painting, arts, and this kind of thing. So I'm sorry. Yeah. So the idea is that we are rethinking the future. So when so we need to have some interdisciplinary approach, I think. And what I think when we start thinking on incorporating musicians and artists is not only to foster diverse perspectives and encourage innovative solutions, but also tap on the creative power that arts has. So I think that's the beautiful thing of this. So there's the emotional and creative power that arts brings to us, and I think it provides a kind of complex, an understanding of these complex changes that we are facing these days. So I think that it's important to have these different perspectives. So what can I say about Elisa? Lots of things. The first one is not about Elisa, but she's sister of my best friend. It's that guy there, the Eliseo. Yeah, and Eliseo introduced me to Elisa, and I love, and it's awesome. Elisa participated in another meeting that we organized here at Mackenzie, and Elisa is Associate Dean of Research, Graduate Studies, and Internationalization in the College of Visual Performing Arts and Professor of Music Education at Syracuse University. She is appointed by the School of Education and VPA. She teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in the areas of choral music, music education, music research, and world music and cultures. She was a core faculty member for the René Crown University Honors Program. And in 2020, she was named the Laura and Douglas Meredith Professor for Teaching Excellence. She was born in Brazil. She was born in Rio de Janeiro. And she earned a bachelor's degree in sacred music, piano at Seminário Teológico Batista do Sul in Brazil, and a bachelor's degree in communications from the Universidade Federal Fluminense. And then she continued her studies in the United States, earning a master's degree in choral conducting from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a PhD in choral music education from the Florida State University. Her research focuses on aesthetic response to music, world music and cultures, international phonetic alphabet, indigenous and Afro-Brazilian culture, clinical simulation applied to music education, so many things. And with her husband, Joshua DeCaney, they found and directed the Samba Laranja, the Syracuse University Brazilian Ensemble. and they perform in many concerts, so you can find at the internet beautiful things. I have many other things. There is a list of awards that received with her work, so beautiful stuff you can find. So we are eager to hear your talk. What do you think about the future? Walter finished his talk with hidden future, so a blank slide. No, I'm just kidding. So let's listen to Elisa. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's again a pleasure to receive you here. Elisa is being a collaborator in other projects, so it's a real pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you very much.
As fate would have it, Syracuse University would have to follow Duke University. For those of you who do not know, there's a beautiful rivalry. I think it's more on our part, perhaps, because they think they're already really good, in basketball between Syracuse University and Duke. So always a great pleasure to be among Duke University fellows and fellows from UCLA and other universities in the United States, but mostly the universities here in Brazil, some of them that were inaugurated after I left the country. And I have collaborated with Mackenzie for a number of years, and I come back to conduct several choirs or engage in music making. This is the first time, however, in almost 30 years that I'm going to deliver something in English and not in Portuguese. So it is quite a treat to be here, and I hope that our conversation will guide us into the future. I like to think about the future. I have no solutions, but it's wonderful to think about what it can be. So that's what I'm going to propose today. I'd like to begin, I don't know, is it moving? Okay. Yeah. Are you going to do it from here? I would like to begin by acknowledging, with respect, the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now stands. I am not in Syracuse, but the work that I do, where I live, and the intellectual thinking that I engage with happens in a field, in a place, in a territory that belongs still to the Onondaga Nation. And going back and looking to the future allows us or requires that we look back into the past, and we cannot forget on which shoulders we stand. Paulo was very nice, talking a lot about me and the things that I've done. I finished my PhD. I thought I was an experimental researcher with all the MANOVAs and ANOVAs and control groups. I stayed there for a little bit. I did a lot of stuff in aesthetic music and music preference. But then I kind of was seduced by the dark side of the force. Syracuse University is very strong in qualitative research. Bogdan and Bicklin were professors at Syracuse University. I remember when I was working my PhD, it was almost like a bad word to say qualitative research. It didn't exist, right? So you really was not a paradigm that people were comfortable with. But as we evolve, so does qualitative research and the protocols that safeguard its validity and accountability. We even have softwares now that can kind of help us code information. So I kind of like navigate. I still collaborate. I have partners actually here in Mackenzie and Syracuse University with clinical simulations applied to music and music education. But I have really kind of like moved a little bit away from that and have focused my work on music and culture, equity and inclusion, and mostly a critical social justice lens to understand what the work that I do. So I hope to invite you to join me today on that. I chose then not to talk about my own specific research, but to think of silence as discourse. Most of the time we are very aware of who is in the room. You can substitute silence for presence or absence, right? Absence as discourse, silence as discourse. In an attempt to move towards voice equity in research practices. I probably will not tell you anything new, so I kind of like hid behind Marcel Proust's premise that the voyage of discovery is not just seeing new landscapes. You have had plenty of new landscapes from excellent researchers who have introduced to you new cells, new protocols, MoMA, and all of that. So today, perhaps we'll feel a little less looking at new landscapes, but seeing things with new eyes. So as we come across things that you already know, try to see with new eyes. And we'll be participating because I'm an educator and I'm a musician. So look at this picture. Raise your hand or don't raise your hand. Raise your hand is a very westernized approach to talking. Brazilians usually talk on top of each other. I remember that. So tell me, what do you see in this picture? Shout out some words. Classical, yes, it looks like classical. Cello. Yeah, lots of violas. Yeah, there's a violist over there. What else? White people, yes. There's what? An Asian, and white people. There are a few females. Who is the conductor? It's a male conductor, right? Very good. They're playing instruments that are westernized instruments. Now, if you really go back to history, the westernized instruments came actually from a lot of cultural iterations in Africa and other world places, but these are the instruments of a traditional orchestra, and this is actually a college orchestra. Written music, yes, absolutely. We go to one of the presentations we had yesterday talking about symbols, right? Who has access to those symbols and can decode what is in those pages? So you see all of that in this picture. Very good. How about this one? Come on, we're going to have to participate here. Take a look at it. Also an orchestra,
I see
similar.
concentration in
What?
all of them. I see concentration. In the first one, people were concentrating. In this
Oh.
one, they're concentrating. They're focused.
Yes, sorry, I had a moment right now because I didn't know where the voice was coming from. I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is a picture, not a video. Who is talking? Yes, thank you. John, right? John. Thank you, John.
Yeah, me, right. There
All
you
right.
go.
I'm like, the heavens are talking to us about the future. Wonderful. What else do you see?
Yeah.
Bassoon, all right.
Hey,
So
that-
the other one, we only saw string instruments. Now we see bassoon. Lots of women. There's a lot of women. How would you describe those women? What are their skin color? Mostly white. Actually, this is the NYU orchestra, right? And you have also particular clothing that you have to wear, right? So you have the full tuxedo in there. Okay, good. And you, by looking at this, you can imagine, there's a percussionist too with the triangle all the way in the back, right? You can imagine what kind of music they're playing because this is an orchestra and that's kind of like, you know, how we associate with that. How about this one? It's very similar. It's an orchestra still, right? So, a lot of black people, some of the same instruments. It's a concerto because you have the symbol that you have the knowledge to say, maybe somebody else would just look at this, wouldn't know that, but there is a cellist right in the front and a pedestal that tells us it is a soloist performing. Yes, very good. What else? You would have not known that, Laura. There you go. Which is a code, right? You go to these environments and you know when to clap, you know when not to clap, and if you clap in between movements, people give you some weird looks. Right? It's a very coded kind of environment. Any other words? Drums, they're drums. They're French horns, they're, all the whole woodwind instruments back there. There's some women, there's some men. There's a lot more black people. That's true. That's true. And he would only know that if he had conducted an orchestra. Yes, because sometimes the conductor moves around, so that's a safety guard right there. It's still a man, right? And that is pretty much the reality of orchestras today, is to a pretty male-dominated environment. And very, very, very few women can break the ceiling of being an orchestra conductor. There's a few ones. There's a few people of color who are now the conductor of the Baltimore Orchestra. Is a very, very young, actually, I think he's Trinidadian. He's not Haitian. He's not African-American, but he came from another place. So all of that as a reference, as a metaphor for what we probably see in research, right? So we see those pictures and we see people missing, right? I use silence because I'm a musician, but if you're not a musician, maybe you could say presence or absence as a form of discourse. And it is distinctive from speech. It's not just the opposite of it. It is its own narrative. It can be. It is also cultural. The Diné children, I said Diné because Diné is the word that the Navajo prefer to use for themselves. It means people of the earth. Language does matter, right? So we identify them as Navajo, but it's not a name that they gave to themselves. They are more inclined to observe quietly. But we favor speech. We so much favor speech that some of you here are specialists and figured it out if the speech is delayed, if the speech is at what it needs to be, if it is not, how we can intervene so a person can communicate wisely and well. We have associated loud voices with protest or the ability to be out advocating for other people. There are some stereotypes that attribute, for example, one of the stereotypes of African American women in the United States is that they have loud voices. They're loud people, right? So stereotypes of people who are loud, but silence can also be a form of protest, as hunger can be a form of protest. My good friend, Dalia Rodriguez, she's a colleague of mine at Syracuse University. She's been looking at silence as discourse with other ones. And she encouraged us to identify and recognize the multiple forms of the meaning of silence. You have the silence that you decided yourself you're going to be silent, and you have the silence that somebody silenced you for whatever reason. And looking at that and trying to understand how these two function so we can understand the experiences of marginalized individuals. So then I thought about COVID-19. It looks like it was 1 million years ago, but it was just a few, 2-3 years ago, and how the not being at the orchestra for some minority groups really, really hurt them. So we know it disproportionately infected rates of infection and death in minority groups or minoritized groups. Native Americans, Indigenous Americans were really, really at that intersection, as were African American communities. So Habush and Deloy and their group decided to look at how can we understand what happened and move forward. So they did a community-based participatory research to try to figure it out. How can we, in the future, be better positioned to not only have better response, but have better data, right, when it comes to including these groups? So they found 3 emerging themes. First of all, there's more mistrust after COVID-19 than before when it comes to mental health and anxiety about treatments, about how they access all the health services. It was necessary to understand the social cultural context if we want to have an effective emergency response. And we need to adapt communication strategies so we can help address some concerns. If you're interested, I wrote a little piece on a blog. I don't even know what it is. I think it's on the Routledge page because it was where I published the book, my last book. But it was looking at some communities in Brazil who were so inventive and creative and developed a communication strategy within themselves. Favela da Maré was one of them, to just overcome some of that. So how can we utilize those communication strategies to that? And the need to amplify the voices of those who were disproportionately affected will greatly impact our ability to then in the future have a response that will be more equitable, right? So we want to reduce health inequity among racial and ethnic minority populations. So that takes us to something that all of you probably know, right? So just look at it with new eyes, is the fact that most clinical trials, and probably I don't know how it is in Brazil, but I'm reporting on what I found in the US, it is, white males who engage into those clinical trials. Black individuals, 5% of the population, or black males, or black individuals, right? Only 5%. So if you think that in the last few years, the social makeup of the United States has changed greatly to increase a much larger number of blacks and Latinos, it's still what they do in the clinical trials does not reflect the population. But you already knew that. And you already knew that American Indian and Native Alaskans, they are almost inexistent when it comes to clinical trials. Yet, they do need healthcare support and treatments when they go to the hospitals for drugs that sometimes will not even follow the protocols of testings in people who look like them, may have their social makeup. Now, it is, in this particular, I don't know if you can see, it's kind of small. But it is a comparison between 2015 and 2019 of clinical trials reported in general medical journals. And it compares. There's a small, tiny little increase. Oh, sorry. I know there's a pointer in here. But I'm afraid of, oh, here. So Black and African Americans, you see the increase is really, really small still from 2015. This is the American Indian and Alaska Native, almost in existence, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, Asians, right? Others and not stated. And you can see here male and female. So there's a lot of work to be done, and federal agencies in the United States and other people are trying to look at that. How can we, in the future, rethinking research practices, be more inclusive in what we do, and what is going to take for us to reach out to those groups? So some of the barriers. Clinical trials are usually in certain places, right? You have to go to a hospital, you may have to go to a university for data collection, assessment, treatment, and so on. That is a barrier because it requires time. It requires resources for food, even if you can help with whatever grants you have. And then you need to leave work that is harder for low-income populations. You sometimes are the caregiver and the person who is providing for your family. That's money that doesn't get into the table. So all of those barriers are ultimately leading white patients in more affluent classes to be able to participate in these clinical trials. Now, you may say, well, in psychology is different, humanities is different, we do things differently. In 2020, right, we got hold of this research, of this writing. I want to say Heinrich, but maybe it could be Heinrich. I don't know how you say his name. I haven't really met him. But he did similar things, right, that they developed this whole way of looking at who is participating in our research. Weird for Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which have results that are not representative of the wider diversity of humanity. In addition to that, there are certain characteristics. Remember, the Western European, the Eurocentric population that kind of, it went to the world, grew. But relative to the population of the world, it's a really small number of people, right? So you take those characteristics and you compare it to an entire world population, and you're going to see that they're very materialistic, young. I love this description of suspended state of adolescence. You're 30, but you're still in your cohort. You're still doing some things, right? While in other countries, they already have families. They're working a number of other jobs. They're leaders in their communities, right? In the United States, the youthfulness, the desire for being forever youthful is right there. Look at my hair. Some people say, why don't you color your hair, right? Well, I am of age to have white hair, and it is okay. But that is one of the characteristics, self-obsessed, right, in respecting other traditions as legitimate. We have words like myth, we have beliefs, right, for things that other people hold dear as truthful for them. Please-seeking, isolated, a lot more time with their cohort. I have 2 young adults, 21 and 19. I see that a lot, how important that cohort is, and they're always doing things together, right? Consumerists and sedentary, that is pretty characteristic. So then, how do we build a more inclusive research practice? I am basing a lot of this stuff in educational frameworks, things that I do in education that we are talking about. Maybe you know some of those, Paulo Freire, of course. Maybe you don't know some of them. They're specifically musicians and philosophers in music. But we need to identify the structural hierarchies that are the barriers that are impeding people to have access to that. We need to carve space for dialogue. I know in controlled environments, right, we have an agenda, we have to start, we have to do. I understand that, I studied that, I have done that. But where can we then think that dialogue and conversation and connections can happen? Maybe not during the data collection, but before, right? So where would we then carve space for dialogue among participants and researchers? So shared decision power from research design to data collection and analysis, that is kind of hard one, right? As I said before, I am thinking about the future. I don't have solutions, and I don't even know how some of this can be implemented. But we can think about it, you know, that these are things that we could think of. And my whole work lately, in the last 2 years, has been about decolonizing the music curriculum. And sometimes we think that all we need is a woman on the podium, or perform music by, you know, underrepresented composers, or by having an orchestra that has more people of color, that in itself is enough. It's not. We have to speak a language and accept certain things that are not mainstream in Western cultures. Because it is very easy to change the way that we do things, or what we teach, but we continue to teach in the same way, right? We favor things that are not particularly coming from underrepresented communities. So I would suggest that we embrace, indigenize, and Afrocentric practice, such as circular logics, holistic perspectives, storytelling, and call and response. So to do that, we need to elevate non-Western ways of thinking and challenge the dominant narrative. We still think that we give excuses. We have a lot of implicit bias. Implicit is exactly, I don't need to say that because you're all psychologists and wonderful people. Things that we're not thinking about, but it is there, right? So we do need to challenge that narrative. For us in Brazil, right, in the Afro-religions, for example, who have, that have been completely ostracized, I want to say a word devilized, but that word doesn't exist. But maybe like non-sacred, right? Something that really should not belong in society because they are tribal, they are primitive, and they have all those kinds of things. Yet it is a very important part of Brazilian culture. How do we legitimize those things? In the United States, hip hop, rap, right? Oh, that's not really music, that's not really culture. How do we embrace those things as we move forward? And we need to really exclude voices that are not historically included. And I will continue to say, in my view, in my little research, we really need to acknowledge Afrocentric and indigenous knowledge as legitimate forms of knowing. Not that they are not scientific, that we don't know how to say it, but legitimate forms of knowing. So let's see how we can embrace those approaches. Holistic approach, which can support the social and emotional well-being of individuals. So I thought about peer mentoring. I thought about collaborative circles, things that you can do prior to your design, trusting relationships with the researcher. Those are kinds of things that are small, but we can start to think about research designs as a holistic approach. Promoting a perspective by connecting all aspects of life and thinking about community more than individual. We usually think of the individual, but it is, if you want to reach out indigenous people to be part of your program, you have to reach out to the community, you have to understand how the community functions for them. So we have also to be very creative and innovative in the way we think and solve problems. Because we are linear, we like, I think of music. I'm going to use a music example. In our curriculum, usually, we begin the year with some pieces, right? Let's say I have an orchestra or a Brazilian ensemble, because I think it's a little bit more inclusive. And I have a number of pieces that I want to do. I prepare those pieces, we rehearse, we have a concert, and then we are done. What if, you know, I did all of that, but I wasn't done? I would come back to that over and over, or add a couple more things and enrich it so it's not just one and done. We spend so much time just doing things once and then not doing it again. And I know replication is an important part of research and what we do, But, and some people do a beautiful job of staying with their subject forever and going back and going back. But how can we do that even, in the design and before we collected data, and then as we are collecting data, as I said, I don't know how it's going to be done, but maybe we can think about some of those ways. Balance between direction and autonomy. Our brilliant Dr. Valtinho was talking about that sometimes we'd say, I gave them specific directions and they should just follow it. So what is the balance between direction and autonomy, right? Or circular logics or holistic thinking. Those can become strengths as opposed to weaknesses. And moving away from the talking to style. This is the lecture style. There's nothing more Eurocentric than this. I talk, you listen. Just this whole style here, I disenfranchise you from participating. Students, usually coming from other cultures, particular African American cultures, are penalized in this environment. They're labeled disruptive. And you will know why, because we're going to get to the call and response. Right? Because in other places, people are used to interacting. They're used to getting up and saying things. If you were in a black church in the United States, you would be saying amen. Or you would be saying, no, right? That interaction, that conversation that is part of it is very, very important for us to move forward. So how do we dismantle this, right, as we move forward in a more indigenized and Africanized or Afrocentric place, and allowing people to share their own ideas and perspectives? I could stay here a little bit. I love storytelling. If you go to Spotify, you're going to hear me speaking Brazilian indigenous stories when my my English Brazilian accented pronunciation. But storytelling is powerful, right? I think it was Guilherme or maybe somebody else was talking about narrative, the video, right? It is a powerful tool. Indigenous people have used that as a way of resilience, to fight acculturation. How could we become a little bit more welcoming to narrative into our research designs, right? And I know all of you are using stories, and how do we tell those stories in a way that is compelling, right? In a way that brings people in. But this is the thing that I find more interesting or find more challenging. To consider oral literacy as important as written literacy. I am a musician trained in Western European styles. There is a code, a score. If I do not know that, I'm illiterate. One of the most humbling things that I've experienced was we had a conference in Brazil of international educators, music educators. Carlinhos Brown. Carlinhos Brown is like a big, big name in Brazilian music, right? The guy is like African related and really powerful, has his own line of jewelry and H-Stern, has recorded a number of things. And he came in and he basically apologized for not knowing how to read music. He has a different kind of literacy. It is musical. It is important. But we do not validate that. We do not welcome there in our westernized Eurocentric view. Because for us, a true musician can read the pages in the score. By the way, Valtinho, I was thinking of when I saw 5, 8, 7. There's so many mixed meters that we could do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Could be a really, really cool thing. So, oral literacy as important as written literacy. Storytelling honors individual perspectives while developing respect for the community. As I said, it is an oral tradition that values the experiences that not necessarily are written down. How do we access that? How do we incorporate some of those elements in our data collection or our design? Is it possible to have a design that would allow people to express some of what they think in a way that is not necessarily in written form? If we did that, if we were to do that, perhaps we would have other kinds of participants and hear other voices that we don't, because we don't have a setup, a structure that accommodates for that. So when it comes to embracing Afrocentric approaches, mostly is refuting the deficit model. right? So if you can think that African Americans, Afro-Brazilians are not coming from a deficit model, you already made a great, great, great stride. And actually embracing what they call Afrofuturism, which is the celebration of black excellence. So in your designs, in your films, videos, if you were to choose something, then you could flip that. You could change the model that you use of somebody with the pants all the way down and a traditionally seen in a very biased way as a thief or a person without any kind of character. If you start to kind of change that, I do this in the educational setting, but what would that look like in a research thinking? And then making knowledge accessible without the need to decipher coded language. The music score is one of that, right? This is actually an article about mathematical education and talking about how the westernized way of doing math requires that you decode so much, right? Yet some Egyptians and other African approaches to mathematical thinking removes away those codes and allow people to then have access and have a much better way of engaging with math. And if you think of, the sheet music is the same way, right? So you remove those codes and then you can have a voice included that you did not have before. So African culture is very, very old. It has survived thousands of years, and it exemplifies a connection with wildlife, with spirituality and all of that. We cannot negate that, right? So we have to embrace that and validate African tradition as legitimate culture and art forms, and embracing them as part of the larger cultural tradition. So then we get to call and response. Shout it out, what is call and response? I know I have some stuff in there that says, but don't look over there. Think what I mean by call and response. Pergunta e resposta. What do you think I'm referring to? Excuse me? Samba de roda. Why samba de roda? Okay. Very, very true. Maybe we could do what samba de roda right now. Let me think one. Here we go. Vem de flor em flor. Vem de flor em flor. Vem de flor em flor. All right, what happens when we're doing this? Tell me, what's going on? First of all, you're really uncomfortable. That's okay. When you pass the uncomfortable, what's going on? What's happening? We're learning. How are you learning? You're trying. I'm asking you to do something, you're repeating. And what did I do? I listened. What I did was I listened. And then I sang it again, and you still didn't get it right, and I listened it again, and then I even used my hands to help you to figure it out what it is. It was better, right? So call and response is a dialogue. It's a conversation. And you could say, I could sing, vem de flor em flor. And once we have become really, really accustomed, you could say, vem de flor em flor. You could create your own melody that would allow it to be part of that. So a dialogue that goes back and forth. How is that going to look like in research? I have no idea, right? But how can we kind of embrace this, listening back and forth? I gave the example of interaction, right? I remember when I was at Florida State and working on my doctorate, I went to see Shaft. Shaft is a traditional black movie, and I think was Samuel Lee Jackson or was the guy. And I went to the theater, with an African-American friend of mine. I didn't know. It was a 10 o'clock movie showing, and there comes families with their children, right? And my judgmental, oh my gosh, it's 10 p.m., they shouldn't be here. They came with their children, and some, and the little bassinets and so on, they came. And the whole experience showed me one thing that I did not know. How important it is to interact. to be able to express one's idea as it is happening. Think of classical music. You cannot do that. You shut up, you sit down, you clap in the right place. But if you go to listen to some jazz, you're expected to clap after, a solo, right? So there's a little bit more improvisation in that sense. But in the movie, right, there was an entire movie theater talking to a screen that could not care less about what was going on. It wasn't about that. Get out of there, don't you know? And it was just like, oh my gosh, brilliant. Because you can say whatever way, it doesn't matter how it is, but you feel free to express your ideas, right? If we had a student, as I said, in a classroom that gets up or say, I agree, or you're wrong, or he speaks without raising the hand, we will label that child, send it to some of you psychologists, and ask you your intervention so we can mold the child to be more in according to that. So call and response, this dialogue, this democratic process of saying something and listening back. Listen back from your participants. How are we going to do that? What else do they have to say? Right? And maybe it is not doing the process that you're collecting data and your experiment is all timed up, but it is before, right? It is before you get to that. So, moving on. Representation does matter. One of the things that is very, very interesting is because most researchers are not from those minority groups that we saw were very reluctant to participate in research trials during COVID, it is hard to recruit. So you need to have people who look like them, who may have the ability to speak words and languages that is welcoming to them. Right? One of the reasons that we change the language that we adapt, it's not just because it's politically correct. It's because we want to engage with people. I want to welcome you, right? So if I'm going to, I mentioned in the beginning, I talked about the land acknowledgement. I used the word Haudenosaunee, and I explained that the Diné is how the Navajo like to be called. The Haudenosaunee were first named Iroquois, which is a colonized name. They refused that. So if I want not to be politically correct, but to respect that the Onondaga Nation, they call themselves the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Long House. Language does matter, representation does matter. So we need to prioritize this commitment to community if we want to include other people in our studies. So how do we move forward? The National Institutes of Health, they already have. I can share this with you, but it's an active link, plans for recruiting women and members of minority groups. People are looking, people are paying attention. Our organizations, our government associations are looking at that. The Food and Drug Administration issued guidance in November 2020 that includes broadening eligibility, and that is actually prior, right? So how we make the process of selecting so exclusive that at the end nobody can really participate in that, or that small group can. So how can you revise the eligibility to be more inclusive when you're likely to recruit more patients? Partnerships. I said that one of the barriers that people have to travel to some places. So it's wonderful that we have different kinds of institutions here, but we can partner with other schools, communities, doctor's office, right? Instead of having to go all the way to downtown or to travel 2 hours, can we build some partnerships that are local that we can work with them? I thought that we could deploy itinerant research teams. Let's go where people are. Let's get in the grant money, in the funding, some money to have these groups that could go and collect data in an itinerant form, right? As I said, I have no solution. I'm just thinking about the future, and if it doesn't work, you just say, that woman, she was just like crazy. I talked about language. There are ways that we say things. I'll give you an example. I was asked to do a survey on leadership. I said, great. I'm a leader, I'm an associate dean, I'll participate, and because I feel really guilty, because I know how important it is to have the data, I did the survey. And the first question that came is like, how do you engage with your subordinates? I'm just like, excuse me? Subordinates? I don't have subordinates. I have partners. I have collaborators. I have colleagues. I have teams. It was such an old language, and I'm just like, I started to question how a leadership survey in 2022 could be used in a language that was so outdated. right? So, and then there are other, this is just a very simple example, but language does matter, how we call people, how we use it. And I think perhaps one way is to have more mixed methods approaches to answering the questions that we have. I told you I converted to the dark side of the force. I think qualitative research has some of the indigenized and Afrocentric things that we talked about with participatory checks, right, where you go back to the participant to say, did I really represent, did I get your narrative the way it was supposed to be, right? Not either or, but a combination of these two methodologies. And then there will be room for call and response. There will be room for some improvisation. There will be room for other things that we believe, even the oral literacy as important, that we may have overlooked if we don't do this kind of partnership. So challenge, we need to continue to refrain from assuming that people are not in the studies, are not participating because they don't want to. When you do our collection, we just did a survey, and our survey, as I look back, I'm like, oh my gosh, a circular logic would be really good here because we probably needed to go back and change a few things here and there. And then we'll say, well, that's your next study. I'm like, yeah, but could we do something like, you know, anticipate as much as we can? And I know we can't, because at the end there will be variables that we didn't think about it. But we were asking questions at places that we already know who was going to answer, right? So we should not be surprised when a survey about parental guardianship, caregiving, 97% of the respondents are women. Because there are males who are caregivers, but we didn't go where they were to get their voices and their opinions on that. We also need to understand that silence and absence, they are discourses and they're saying something. What are they saying and how are we going to respond? I think indigenized and Afrocentric approaches can be an exciting way to look at how we're going to include non-Western European groups into what we do, and utilizing circular logics and storytelling to include the community as key influencer. If we want participation from indigenous groups, we have to go where they are. We have to forge partnerships. We have to have conversations. We have to be part of who they are. We have to understand. We have to remove the deficit thinking that we have and to say we're going to go there to save them, we're going to go there to teach them, to colonize them, to teach them the good ways, right? We need to embrace the way that they learn. We need to embrace the way that they know. And that is, I think, the biggest challenge for us. And that's the same thing for Afrocentric. Two things that I would like to end with. A diversity advocate, not in the ethics committee, but in your research group. Somebody who will always call, how is our language? Are we thinking of this? Are we considering that? We have usually diversity advocates in searches in our higher ed searches in the United States, because it's very easy to say, oh, they're coming from Duke, or they need to be, or Stanford, or they're from Juilliard. And sometimes, not sometimes, most of the time, the people who go to these institutions are already from a certain demographic. So we need someone to say, hey, did you consider Ursini College in Pennsylvania? I don't know. Have we looked at, can degrees from other places still be valid for people applying for our jobs? Are we going to be really just like, they have to come from these institutions? And when we do that, then we already disenfranchise a whole bunch of people in that. So is it worth it to have a diversity advocate in our team? Somebody who will always, their job will be to question if we are in alignment with data and with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And equity audits. This is another education thing, which is a systematic and regular and disciplined examination of research practices through the lens of diverse participants. So basically what it is you look at policies, programs, practice that directly or indirectly impact humans relative to the race. And some of you are doing this work so beautiful in so many areas. But in this particular thing, you look at the data and you develop a sustainable way of looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion with a group of community-based people who are from these groups, right? As I said, I'm not talking about the ethics committee. I'm talking about, is it possible that an institute could have, a group of people from the community who, in the process of thinking about research, design would sit with us, would have conversations with us, would discuss, would help us to ask the hard questions. Some of these questions are very uncomfortable for some people. For some people, they're not, right? But for others, it is kind of hard. I am a musician. I study music from Europe or Western European traditions. When I talk about white privilege, people get really upset. But it is a privileged vision that this music from a small group of people permeates pretty much everything that we do and everything that we teach. Those are hard questions, and we kind of need to ask them. So to conclude, Afrocentric and indigenized practices can be a very important way for us to rethink our practices and research and education and everything that we do. Incorporating those non-Eurocentric views will probably help us to be more inclusive and recruit more people. And we will then give the individual and the community a seat at the orchestra or at the table or at the clinical trial. You change it, creating opportunities for dialogue, call and response, storytelling, and excellence as inherently integral to their culture. And I have the references here. If you're interested, I can share them with you. And I am done.
Thank you very much, Elisa. It was a wonderful talk. So it's open to questions now.
Thank you, Professor. It was really, I think that's pretty much the opposite of what you wanted, but I'm kind of speechless here. So,
It's a narrative.
okay, great. But I was kind of thinking about the fact that we try to be inclusive in our research. We want to change the world for better. But what are we actually doing in our labs, So what you said about having someone there at the lab to think the experiments with us and to, kind of help us through it, because we're trying to erase racism and what was it called? Your study? Gender bias, sorry. But we're not actually listening to those people. I think it's kind of hard, but I also don't know how to change this, how to actually invite someone in or to ask their opinions about what we're doing. So I don't know, I just kind of need some help thinking this.
I think perhaps we take one thing, right? Is there one thing that we could do to try it? I think we also sometimes have the urge to try everything, right? And I don't think that that's probably what we should do. But maybe we can start looking at the language of our surveys or the language that we use in our experiments. Is the language inclusive? Is it welcoming? Am I saying something here that will put people away? And I tell you, I navigate the world, not in Brazil, but in the United States. I am a documented immigrant, but I am an immigrant. I am an English language learner. English is not my first language, right? So when I speak, people already know I don't belong, right? I am an Afro-Brazilian person with a white mother and a black father. I am highly educated. I am not first generation in college, but I navigate the world in my positionality. This is a term that we use a lot, right? That is my position. And I experience a lot of things every day that sometimes, rubs me in a way that I would prefer that would have not, right? For example, we were interviewing a candidate for a very important position, and the person said, well, one of the things that I do to support my faculty my faculty of color is that I send them to conferences where they probably are not invited to participate, so they can get to the way of the land and they can be introduced to that. To me, that rubs in the wrong way, because first of all, why are you already assuming that that person doesn't have a seat at that table, right? So I appreciate the support, but what you're saying basically is telling me that when you look at a person like me, you're already assuming that I don't have the research that is quality, with good quality, to be at the table of that particular conference. So those are kind of small little things in our dialogue. But sometimes we need somebody who understands that, right? Who can speak. And then we need to just be comfortable that we will be asked hard questions and we'll have to change that. In our study that we just finished with Eliseo and some of his wonderful students, we used the research that uses parental affect, right? Parental cognitive skills. Everything is parental. That's the research and the model that we use. But as I was reading, I was thinking of the grandmother who is not really a parent, but has been raising their child because, you know, many, many different aspects, right? I was thinking of the gay couple who adopted a child, and they're not technically the biological parents, they're parents, but are they going to see themselves as parents? So can we then use, and we chose to use guardians, alternatively, caregivers, and words that are just welcoming. They're say, hey, because I see parental, I'm not going to answer that because I'm not a parent, right? But if you change that to guardian or caregivers, or you may just change that a little bit. So I think this work is hard work, and we need to start small. And sometimes it's just like the language, or the figures that we're using, the pictures that we're using, the videos that we're using. What does it say, right? I'm going to say something here to Brazilians. As someone who is expatriate, right? I've lived in the United States for almost 30 years. I'm always in awe of how much we reject our culture in favor of American culture. Every time that I come back, there are more words in the Portuguese vocabulary, there are words in English, than they are in Portuguese. Words that already exist, right? Oh, I'm going to... Vou falar em português. Eu vou deletar isso aqui. Deletar, from delete. Actually, it's a word that exists. It's to erase, apagar. But we embrace those kinds of things that are very, very important. So I think going back to some of these important things for our culture and preserving some of that in language, I think it's a small step, but we could try.
Well, I'd like to know if I can consider your research to maybe integrate people. For example, I'm doing a research with a certain group of people, for example, autistic children. If I should somehow in this approach integrate these children in the process of analyzing their own data, analyzing their own behavior. Because I was like, I have never done that. I have never shared data in a way they can produce their own analysis and maybe consider their analysis in my conclusions, or integrate them in the process of writing the conclusions with me in a way which my written text will convey not only my thoughts, but also children thoughts, you know?
Well, I come from a university that was pioneer in inclusion of people with disabilities in the school, right? The School of Education, Syracuse University. Doug Bicklin, he did a lot of documentary with people with autism. I can tell you that on Broadway right now, if you go to Broadway, those of you who live in the United States, or those of you who go to New York City, there is a play called How to Dance in Ohio. How to Dance in Ohio has a plot of a parent or a teacher of a group of people with autism, students with autism, who had to go to their first prom. If you're not American, maybe you don't understand that. I never understood, and my kids would say, Mom, you just don't get it. You don't live here, you don't know it. High school students in the United States have these big bailes, proms, right? Where you go and you have a certain dress and you have to have a partner, somebody has to ask you to go with them. There's this whole involvement that it is actually quite taxing. I'm pretty sure some psychologists are studying the effects of, prom anxiety and all of that into the lives of young teens. And he wanted this group of students with autism to go to the dance. And the whole play is about that. It was pilot at Syracuse University with Syracuse Stage. And the whole cast is actually people neurodivergent on the spectrum. And the whole production was done with their input, to the point that my husband, who is a percussionist, was playing an instrument called cajon, and it broke. That particular cajon broke, but he had two exactly same cajons. And then the next day, he just put the new one in there because the other one broke, and that threw the whole thing out to the window. Everybody was missing their steps, and he's just like, I don't get it. It was the same instrument, same maker, but apparently the way that it was done, it had a higher pitch than the previous one. And the cast was really, really, really unsettled. I think there's an opportunity for you to think, where is it appropriate, right? In qualitative designs, that could be from beginning, right? Where you really hear the voices. And the folks who do a lot of research with people in the spectrum, they believe that the voices of people in the spectrum are the voice that we need to hear, right? There's a whole bunch of movies, a whole bunch of things. So I think if what you're doing allows for storytelling and allows for the presence and allows for, participant check and all of that, it is great, right? If it is a design that doesn't allow for that, maybe you should question it. But if you want their voices, what would be the methodology to use to really make sure that their voices are heard and incorporated into that? That's what I would say.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Elisa. Thank you for the talk, and thank you for the free ear candy we got when you were trying to make us respond in a in tune way. I have one question and probably one suggestion that has to do something to do with the question from the colleague here. Then I'll start from here to follow up. I've been a professor of qualitative methods before being a neuroscientist, and one of the ways to go doing that that has been very well established is that is one case of participant research, which is participant as researcher. So you have literature that goes right now, 2023. It probably goes back more than 20 years, maybe 25 years. Yeah, I can send you some references. And again, then there is something that I believe your talk was suggesting about when you talked about call and response. Being a professor of qualitative methods, I remember one of the best definitions of interview I've ever read. I think it was from Kvali, from the Norse researcher, and also the phenomenological tradition says that an interview is an encounter. That's the definition. And an encounter is naturally call and response. And sometimes call and response will be like Brazilians talking on top of each other. And from that kind of encounter is that you're going to really have the voices that can be heard. This is just a commentary. And the question, I have a question. I have a question from having lived in the States and in the UK for much less time than someone like you. The question is, in surveys and in questionnaires, and you say, and you were absolutely so right in stressing that, words matter, but also concepts and categories matter. And those categories for ethnicity vary wildly from country to country. They have varied in the US historically. My particular case, my anecdotal case from 20 years ago was that I didn't know what I was because I was white here, and there I was something else, which we didn't know. We were not Latino, of course, and I came to know that I was miscellaneous, which is not very flattering of a word. However, the concepts are important. The categories are important. And when we come to Brazil, we're going to have different categories. For instance, for ethnicity, I remember that when we have when we go through researching and we deal with the social demographic questionnaires, sometimes the categories change. So we have used, I don't remember right now, but we have used black and pardo, which would be brown, which is a bit weird, not weird in the acronym sense, but weird in the not sounding well sense, maybe for some contexts of publication. And that is my point. How do we go about, or can we go about, having some sort of way to make inclusiveness, which right now I see as when we from Brazil have to adapt our questionnaires to American Eurocentric standards. Otherwise, we won't be understood by the referees. So, how can we go about in trying to internationalize the inclusiveness process that is going on when we try to make sense and we try to make justice with those categories? Do you think that is possible?
As I said, I don't have a lot of answers, but I think what we need to understand, and perhaps one part of this is really highlighting how one size does not fit all. There is a book called Pigmentocracies. I shared that with Lizzie when he was there, and it is a whole study of race in Latin America. In the United States, when I first got there 30 years ago, I remember people looking at me as like, what are you? Right? What are you? Not black enough, not white enough. I'm confused. What are you? Not who are you, but what are you? And it was the first time that I understood that it was not that it was in the minority, because in my country, there's a lot of people who look like me. And then suddenly I was then categorized as a minority, underrepresented, and so on. So I actually had a shift of identity when I went to the United States, and actually embraced a lot more of my African descent than I ever had in Brazil, because I never really felt I needed to make that overt, right? But I do, have a mother who is white with green eyes, and it was, already as an adult trying to figure that out. So the book Pigmentocracies talk about how in Latin America, particularly, when we study race, it's not black and white. I have a chapter in my book, it's called It's Not Always Black and White. Because you have all these different shades that, allow you. So if I go to my hairdresser here and I straighten my hair, put some makeup, I can navigate Brazilian culture as a white person, right? I probably cannot do that in the United States, because even if I did, I wouldn't. But there are all these things in Latin America, and self-identification. And one of the interesting things that I had in the United States was when I applied for immigration status. I married an American. I had to submit my documents. My birth certificate says I'm white, but my picture, so how do I, right? So I said, well, it does say in my birth certificate, just I want to say it is, when I was born, that was how people kind of categorized me. So I think what we need to do to reviewers, and when we do things that are specifically to Brazil, and it changes all the time. When I wrote this book, about race, food, and music in Brazil, we were using negros e pardos, coisas assim. But now it's preto, or black, right? Because we like to model after the United States. And that goes back to my thing over here, right? The word negro in Portuguese is not an offense. It never was. In the United States, it is. So in the United States, they don't use that. But we gave it up. So we say preto e branco to align with black and white. So those are kinds of things that we see ourselves because we sometimes refuse who we are. But the word negro in Portuguese does not carry for the majority of the population the meaning that it carries in the United States. The United States is a bad word. You don't say it. You don't use it, right? But in Brazil, it was never that. If you go to Latin America, there's a whole collection of songs. Dorme, duerme, negrito, que tu mama está cantando, negrito. It's not offensive, it's part of that. But we changed it. So I don't have an answer for how the categories are changing. They're going to change again tomorrow. They're going to change again in the future. I think what it's important, maybe like a little notation, is how, and I urge you to take hold of this book, Pigmentocracies, because it's a big research group for Latin American studies who did a whole inventory of how Latin Americans see race, and then maybe you can kind of draw some comparisons. I don't know, are we done?
Thank you so much for your talk. I learned a lot. And I just wanted to ask about like quality research and the things that everyone like asked. But in regards to like cultural literacy, do you think like the quality methods should include that part, or it's only about like us as like students searching for other materials so that we can learn more about the like a quality method? No, I think it's more if the part of understanding the culture is before we learn about a quality method, or it's integrated, or if it is needed.
I think I understood you, but if I didn't, you forgive me, and then we can chat outside. What I suggest about mixed methods, it's not a blank statement. So what guides our methodology, you all know, it is a question. What is it we want to know, right? So if you are really interested in knowing somebody's cultural, do you want to know it just generic things? Do you want to engage with a group of a smaller group and know a lot about them? So that will determine what kind of methodology you're going to use. Qualitative methodology is usually something a little bit more intimate that allows for dialogue and conversation, you know, semi-structured or non-structured interviews where, you know, you don't have a pre-oriented menu of things that you want to ask, and then the data will tell you what's happened, right? So it is time-consuming, but usually something that you do with a smaller group. Perhaps if you're interested in knowing how the Crao Indians live in Tocantins or in their part, and you want to engage with that. It came from, you know, anthropological research, sociological research, where you immerse yourself in a small group and then you try to figure it out, what's happening in that place. It's usually not generalized, right? It is an understanding of a phenomenon or something that is happening over there. So if your question is to know in depth something about a small group of people, I would say the approach would be a qualitative approach. And if you're interested in that, it is actually pretty solid right now, the methodology and how you do that. There's many different ways of doing that. Sometimes you have a ground theory, sometimes there are emerging themes, there are group participation, there are action research where people, you know, practitioners engage in that. So I'll be glad to talk to you some more about that.
Thank you very, very much, Elisa. It was a beautiful talk. I was thinking, because we're planning many experiments on, for example, brain synchronization during, for example, cooperative tasks. And usually you start drawing the designs like, oh, the guy needs to follow an arrow and the other one needs to follow in the same way. And then you just gave us a beautiful idea with the call and response you did here. Because, yes, in fact, we didn't. You just start singing and people start singing in response. And at the end, we were putting people together, connecting minds, and it was a beautiful moment. Yeah, exactly, yeah. All people together, yeah. It's beautiful, yeah, it's beautiful.
The nice thing about call and response is that you can kind of adjust things without having to stop and say, you were singing that wrong.
Yeah.
So, you know, you can
That's
adjust
beautiful.
things without having to stop and say.
And then you can see how it evolves, both behaviorally and neurologically speaking. Yeah, it's beautiful, yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Elisa, again. Thank you. So So now we are moving to our last talk in the morning. So Professor John Neslick, are you? I think he's at the internet. Let me see. Yeah. So it's my pleasure to introduce the Emeritus Professor John Neslick. John, he's a distinguished scholar in the field of social and personality psychology with a profound emphasis on cross-cultural research and naturally occurring social interactions. John graduated in psychology at Duke University and did his master and PhD in social psychology at the University of Rochester. He's professor of psychology at College of Williams and Mary, USA, and at the University of Social Science and Humanities in Poland. His editorial board of many journals like Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Social Influence, Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology, and many others. John Neslick has authored several impactful books, and just to mention one that I think is a mandatory book for all of us doing cross-cultural research. Everybody needs to read the multi-level modeling for social and personality psychology and all the papers that follow that book. I usually say that this is the father of multi-level models and how we use that in psychology. In recent years, I have had the privilege of learning this analysis directly from him. And I need to say my initial questions about the analysis were almost embarrassingly elementary and with an incredible, if you know John, with an incredible sense of humor and profound knowledge. I can say that I have learned a lot of multi-level analysis, and at the end I made a great friend. So John, welcome, even from another country, be welcomed by us. So it's a real pleasure to have you here with us.
Paulo, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Perfect, it's perfect.
Excellent. Now, can you see my, can you see my screen? Yes?
Yeah, we can see it, but we can see it with the, not the second screen. We can see your slide. Yeah, you are in the,
You can see
the presenter's
you can see
view.
the title, right?
No, you can see as you are probably seeing as the presenter view.
Ah, okay, well, I don't know how to fix that.
What?
Morgana, do you know how to fix this?
I think we have some.
Yeah.
Where's this?
It's,
Yeah.
Okay. Walter is saying that at the up left might have something like sweet screens. Now we are seeing all.
I think it is more here. Right. Okay. Mm-hmm.
yes.
Show taskbar, maybe it is
Show
here.
taskbar. I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
I
how's
think,
that?
yeah, I think, let me see.
Is it okay? I will go to see.
Okay. People are saying that there is a 3-point symbol just below the slides. Yeah, click on there. Let me see. And now, not that one. Okay.
I apologize. I'm not very sophisticated.
No problem at all, John. No problem at all. That's fine.
Well, anyway, can you see this?
Now we are not seeing these lights anymore.
You're not seeing anything.
No.
This is embarrassing.
No, no.
Well,
At all.
anyway, I'm going to be talking for a little while about prosociality.
But if you want, you can send me. I can open it here.
Well, let's see how this looks.
Oh yeah, I think it's. Oh yeah, yeah,
Good enough.
yeah. It's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I add something? At least, I do not know how to do this.
It's fine.
Yeah, it's
So,
good.
Yeah. We'll see a little bit more than you want to, perhaps. First, bom dia and obrigado. Thank you for inviting me, and it is with considerable sadness that I provide this presentation electronically, because I had really hoped to be able to meet everyone in person in Brazil, but unfortunately it was not possible. Nevertheless, I'm going to be talking today about prosociality. I'm going to be describing a new model that I have proposed and some preliminary findings supporting that model. And so, prosociality, generally speaking, and in terms of how I view it, consists of the positive attitudes and beliefs about and dispositions towards other people, and the behaviors that people exhibit. This is a fairly traditional definition. Where my model diverges from what has been done in the past is that I distinguish what I refer to as interpersonal and ideological prosociality. All right? These are distinct but related types of prosociality. And I will define them in a moment, and I think you'll be able to appreciate the difference. Interpersonal prosociality is the domain that includes how people think about and behave towards others. This is the traditional definition of prosociality: helping behavior, social support, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is, if you take a look at prosociality, you see it almost defined, sometimes exclusively, in terms of helping behavior. My belief is there's a lot more to prosociality than simply this type of interpersonal, which is why I began to think about what I describe as ideological prosociality. The ideological domain includes the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are relevant to the collective, to human rights, social policies, the environment, a whole variety of things. Domain does not concern specific people, but collectives. So if you ask if someone is ideologically pro-social, you're not asking if they like people, but rather you're asking if they have attitudes and beliefs and values that are about the collective of humanity. There are a variety of other constructs that are similar to this, but nevertheless, I think that this distinction is unique and, as I hope I will demonstrate to you, informative. Now, what's important is you can have one and not the other. So someone may help a stranger push a car out of the snow. I know not the best example for Brazil, all right, but oppose human rights policies. Someone may demonstrate for the fight against climate change, but may not stop to help an elderly person across the street, or they just may not help anyone. They want ecological justice, but in terms of interpersonal prosociality, they're just not very pro-social. Now, I'm going to be describing the preliminary findings from two studies that are based upon the European Social Survey. By the way, for those of you who are not familiar with the European Social Survey, it's conducted every other year in between 15 and 25 or 30 countries in Europe. It varies. And it is one of the, I think, premier cross-cultural databases that in the world. It received the Galileo Award for the best social science project in Europe a few years ago. It's great, and it's free. You can access the European Social Survey, all of the data for free. They give it an SPSS file, stata files, whatever you want. It's excellent scholarship, and I have found it to be very valuable. Now, what I decided to do was I looked at the European Social Survey, and each year since 2002, the survey has included a measure of Schwartz's basic human values. If you're not familiar with this, it's a very popular, widely used measure of basic human values. There are literally thousands of citations to it. And the European Social Survey has administered these values every year in almost every country. There have been some minor exceptions. And I looked at these values and I realized that in Schwartz's basic human values, there are what he calls universalism and benevolence. And if you look at the items that make up these two, they are corresponding very closely to what I would call as ideological and interpersonal prosocial values. Schwartz's measure of values used what is called the portrait value questionnaire. Each item is preceded by the stem. How much like you is this person? And then an individual selects a response that indicates how closely. The questions are gender specific. So how much you like him or how much you like her. So for example, what I consider to be the measure of universalism are ideological prosocial values. And if you take, here are the three items. She strongly believes that people should care for nature. It is important to her to listen to people who are different from her. She thinks it's important that every person in the world should be treated equally, right? And these are items that an individual says, it's a little bit like me, it's not at all like me, it's a lot like me. I believe that these measure or capture what I consider to be ideological prosocial values. In contrast, there are what are called interpersonal prosocial values, which Schwartz used the label benevolence. And the two items that measure benevolence are, it's very important to him to help the people around him. It's important to be loyal to his friends. And what you can see here is a difference in the emphasis, the generalizability of the two different measures. Universalism talks about nature, the environment, people in general. Benevolence talks about individuals who are part of your inner network, your friends, et cetera, et cetera. So two very different aspects of prosociality. Now, to examine the relationships between prosociality and other outcomes, I did a series of multi-level modeling analyses. I'm not going to talk about the details of that right now. It falls under the heading of fancy statistics. Conceptually, what you do is for each country, you estimate a regression equation, and then you have the mean values for the sample. So for example, we might, the ESS has an item, attitudes towards immigrants. And so basically I just tried to predict attitudes towards immigrants with a measure of ideological prosociality and a measure of interpersonal prosociality. And the analysis answers the question, what is the average relationship between the two measures of prosociality and attitudes towards immigrants? So across however many countries were in the ESS, we calculate an average relationship, and that's what we find. Now, the first study was published in New Ideas in Psychology in 2022, and I analyzed data from Wave 8 of the European Social Survey. 44,000 respondents in 23 countries. So one of the nice things about using the ESS is you have nice big data files. No lack of power. The results were fairly straightforward. there were positive relationships between ideological pro-social values and attitudes towards immigrants, refugees, gays and lesbians, attitudes about the environment, climate change, social benefits, and income equality. So, ideological pro-social values predicted attitudes, positively predicted attitudes about what I would consider to be ideological pro-social topics. In contrast, relationships between these attitudes and interpersonal pro-social values, that is benevolence, were either negative or not significant. So, people think, well, Jack is a nice guy. Well, Jack may be a nice guy. He may be friendly and he may be pro-social, but Jack may not like immigrants. He may not like gays and lesbians. He may not favor social justice. So these are two very different ways of looking at pro-sociality. The second study, which was published in Applied Psychology, Health and Wellbeing in 2023, took data from all nine European social surveys. And I got here, almost 500,000 respondents. There were 38 countries across the different waves of the studies. In this case, what I was interested in looking at was well-being. And my underlying suspicion and hypothesis was that ideological pro-sociality comes at a cost. If you're ideologically pro-social, you may be a little bit different than most people. You don't maybe not fit into the norm so much. You're a little deviant. And what I found was benevolence was positively related to satisfaction with life and happiness, whereas universalism was negatively related to satisfaction with life and happiness. So if you're interpersonally pro-social, you're happier and you're satisfied with your life than if you're not interpersonally pro-social. If you're ideologically pro-social, you're not as happy with your life, and you're not as happy as if you're less ideological pro-social. Universalism was also negatively related to self-reports of social activity. So, even if we took the effect of the data collection across time, these relationships did not change. So from early 2000, from 2002 to 2018, the relationships were equivalently in terms of strength and direction. So, what we have here is, once again, a demonstration that pro-sociality exists in these two separate domains, and that being pro-social has different implications. In the first study we talked about, it was more of a confirmation study about what it means to be universally, to be ideological pro-social in terms of your attitudes and social attitudes and beliefs, and here had more to do with well-being. So, at least based on studies of values, and I have some other data that I'm not going to present here, ideological and interpersonal pro-sociality seem to be different constructs. Now, for some of you may be familiar with Schwartz's theory of values, universalism and benevolence are factors of a common factor called transcendentalism. Well, these analyses and others I have done suggest that this may not always be the best way to think of the relationship between universalism and benevolence. That is, they act in opposite directions. And so to think of them as having this common factor, transcendentalism, it doesn't really quite capture it. I should add that these are preliminary findings. This is the beginning of what I hope will be a concerted, focused set of studies. And in fact, Paolo discussed, we had a grant application in Poland that unfortunately didn't get funded to do a series of studies on this topic. So I really like this idea. I'm going to try to run with it for the next few years and see what comes up. Now, I've talked about rethinking the future in terms of pro-sociality. Now I want to talk about rethinking the future for all of us. And here I'm going to say compared to the previous 50 years. Why did I choose 50 years? Well, it's 50 years ago that I started my postgraduate studies. So I'm looking at 50 years of my life, and I'm thinking about what has happened since then, and what do I expect to happen in the next 50. I probably won't be around, but it'll be the next 50. To put it simply, I believe that dark times are ahead. I believe that anti-science, particularly among the right, is growing. We have climate change denialism, anti-vaxxers, denial of human rights, denial of social justice, and so forth. These tend to occur together. The anti-vaxxers tend to be climate change deniers. They all tend to be opposed to social justice, a whole host of things. As an example of this is a paper that Marjana and I published in the Journal of Religion and Health. It's about religion, politics, and science. Put simply, belief in God is negatively related to the distress people feel about climate change, and is positively related to climate change denial. Many of you go, oh yeah, I know if you're religious, you don't believe in climate change, the whole thing. However, the relationship between belief in God and climate change distress disappears after controlling for left-right political orientation. So you can say that people who believe in God don't have a less, they're less distressed by climate change, except that has to do with their political orientation. We found this in 4 samples, in Poland and the US, in students and in nationally representative samples. This is not a fluke finding. I think there's a quote that I took from a chapter by Graziano. Today, when politics too does not require people to know but to believe, we witness a new reconciliation between the two camps. It is a soft return to the Middle Ages in which both politics and religion lose their specific features and are drawn toward the flattening of an ignorance, which, although it still preserves its formal pretense, has nothing holy anymore. So this is the unholy trinity: politics, religion, and climate change. And I don't think that it's unique to climate change. What's the solution? We must speak out. We cannot let the voices of ignorance, fear, and hate dominate the conversation. We must recognize the difference between public and scientific discourse. We have an obligation as scientists to contribute to the public discourse. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, debated p-values while climate change metastasized. Is it p less than 0.01, 0.001, 0.05? This was a debate that no one cared about outside of the scientific community. And while we did that, climate change took off like a monster. We cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We don't need to compromise our principles, but we need to be part of the conversation. We need to make a difference. Solidarity. As Benjamin Franklin, a famous patriot, noted, we indeed must all hang together, and hang together is an idiom for solidarity. We indeed must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. The future is now. The forces of anti-life have organized. The conflict is not coming. It has begun. It's here. It's in your countries. You can see it on the television. You can see it in the internet. It's here. We must act. We cannot afford to lose. The future of humanity is at stake. We cannot afford to lose. And keep in mind that the longest journey starts with a single step. Take the first step, whatever that is for you. Thank you.
Whoa, thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. What a impactful talk. Thank you very much. I'm opening now to questions. So yeah, we have one there.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a question about the kind of the first half, the psychology model. I like a lot of what you said in the second half as well. But so to the finding that you were talking about, that the kind of universalism, the ideological pro-sociality being negatively related to well-being, and then the inverse for interpersonal. I mean, my broad question is, do you have thoughts about why that might be? And then here's like a specific proposal that I'm curious what you think about, right? There's lots of work in social psychology showing that kind of general beliefs in controllability in various senses is predictive of well-being, right? So self-efficacy, self-determination, so on and so forth. Hypothesis. If the thing you really care about is like ideological pro-sociality, you look around the world and it's really hard to do much about a lot of the things that you are really focused on, that you see as being really bad, or it feels like it can be really hard to do anything about those. In contrast, if the thing you really care about is just the well-being of your neighbors or your ability to help them, it's often very easy to help individuals in smaller interpersonal contexts. So therefore, you feel like you have a lot of control to implement this value. So I'm curious if what you think about that hypothesis, if you have other work that goes against that, supports that, or if you have general background thoughts on a kind of explanation for the findings you presented.
Okay, well, first, it's clear that you read my grant proposal.
I have no power to fund it, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, I wish that you had, because that's one of the things that we discussed in the proposal, is this idea that, if you're ideological pro-social, the world is going to hell. The climate is going to shit. There's war all over the place. Income inequality is rising. It's not a happy place for people who are ideological pro-social. And it's not going to be a happy place unless things change dramatically. And so, yes, I agree with you. And I have some other data to show that, sort of just what you talked about, how the policy attitudes and things like that are related to well-being in ways that you just described. So I don't have those data handy. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the explanatory mechanisms has to do with this sense of the fact that ideologically pro-social people are living in a world that is not consonant with their values.
Thank you so much.
Quite welcome. Thank you for the question.
Hi. Very interesting. You raised a lot of issues. I want to focus on your pessimism at the end and everything going to hell. And my question is, do you think the younger generation is going to hell as well? Because it seems like a lot of the problems that you're talking about are old folks like me. And a lot of the young folks that I know are not anti-science, and they don't have all the same traits. And so maybe there's a little hope that we can just wait until people like me die out.
That's an interesting question. None of the results from the analyses I did of the ESS, all of them controlled for age, and it didn't matter. All right, and the ESS makes an explicit point to get a nationally representative sample in each country. So the relationships, now I will confess I didn't look at interactional hypotheses. That is, did the relationships exist with the same strength for young and old people? The work that we did, keep in mind that the belief in God and climate change studies, those had both student samples, primarily younger people, and nationally representative samples, which were nationally representative in terms of age. And literally you could just, I copy and pasted the results from one study to the next because they were so similar. So I hear you, and I hope that it's the case. There, as you may know, there was just a recent election in Poland, and and the younger people came out in much higher numbers than they ever had before in an election. And the opposition held the day, and there'll be a new government here to replace the sort of nationalist, vaguely kind of ultra right-wing government that was here now. And I think the youth vote, the younger vote, had something to do with that. I haven't seen the statistics yet. The election was just Sunday. So, but yeah, I mean, I don't think it's exclusively an old person's problem.
Okay. Other questions?
I have a comment just on the tone of the positive way, but it's reminding of Carl Rogers that in the late 70s, beginning of 1980s, he wrote a piece of a reasoning about person of tomorrow. I don't know if people, I just knew that a few years ago, and I went through this writing, and it's in the context of the, well, the Cold War and apartheid and, you know, many horrible things that happened at that moment. And despite of the fact that he also thinks that people should meditate and things like that, he also describes quite well the abilities and competencies of the person of tomorrow that would be basically be, you know, aware scientifically and also knowledgeable and also having literacy about the media and things like that, that are very similar to the period we are living today. And we passed by the Cold War and then also the apartheid, and life became a little bit better. So perhaps these dark ages around the Middle Ages, they will not take 500 years to run out. We can, you know, live till we see the change again, as perhaps Rogers could do that. And I just have a question for the group, the general group, because I like very much, I didn't know about the European Social Survey. And perhaps we could aim not with the INCT specifically, but with partnerships with, I don't know, IBGE or something like that, to run a similar survey, perhaps in Brazil, perhaps in South America, because it's a valuable predictor. I like the way you analyze that, show that it's stable over time. So meaning that I think I would take from the thing I said before and this data that benevolent and universalism might suffer occasionally, but they survive to the next wave of the survey to be there and make their points. So maybe the quality of life is not that good, the satisfaction is not that good, but they survive till the next wave.
Yeah, apropos, I've just finished writing a paper on meaning in life and self-esteem, in which I discuss Rogers pretty extensively. And, you know, Rogers, I mean, is inspirational if you read him, because of his belief that, you know, there's something inherently good in all of us, and that the goal of life is to discover this and to continue to grow. And so from a Rogerian perspective, the types of difficulties that society is experiencing now are just bumps in the road and sources for growth. And so I think that your point is well taken, that, you know, that yes, there is light, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not a train. It's just that I think we've been complacent. I think as scientists, we've been complacent, that, you know, we value objectivity, we value detachment. We value a whole host of very desirable sort of scientific method attitudes and behaviors. But we have sort of let the narrative be controlled by the non-science people. I mean, you know, look at the IPCC. The science doesn't get any better. And yet we have national figures across the world simply saying it's not true. I think we need to fight more.
Other questions? Other questions? No? No? Okay. John, again, thank you very, very much for your talk and for being with us in this meeting, and hope to bring you here to Brazil soon.
Yeah, and I hope to be there even more than you want me to.
No. Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So with this, we end our morning session now. Let's take a break for lunch. And for people from the National Institute, we have our meeting in the lab in the afternoon. Okay. Thank you again, John.